About a month ago, I released a video where I took the knowledge gained from 4 years at media school and used it to break down the nightmarish PR strategy employed by NIJISANJI in their termination of Selen Tatsuki, aka Dokibird. This was a corporate PR strategy so unethical, so incompetent, and so disastrous that the fallout from it breached containment and made it into mainstream news. However, at the time that I'm editing this video, the situation seems to have settled down. Following her termination, Dokibird experienced a meteoric rise as a content creator and is currently thriving as an independent VTuber. And as for NIJISANJI, they've had other scandals to occupy the public's attention.
Oh my god! This is still in the works, guys. This is not ready.
They've been exposed. That being Anycolor Incorporated's NIJISANJI, who recently has had an unsigned talent contract making its rounds, as originally reviewed exclusively by Florida man lawyer Legal Mindset.
There are some places where this agreement would be completely thrown out because they did not get approval under the local labor law or local labor rules.
At least regarding the termination of Selen Tatsuki, it looks like this might just be the end of the entire saga. But that doesn't mean that this is all there is to it. A number of commenters in my last video mentioned that the whole situation bore several similarities to something that happened almost an entire year prior, that being NIJISANJI En's only other official termination, the termination of Zaion, LanZa. Now, I'd only started watching Vtubers in late August of 2023, so I wasn't around to witness Zaion's termination, which took place in March of that year. But I was vaguely aware of two things. One, that Zaion had, to date, the shortest tenure of any talent at NIJI En, and two, that after her termination, Sayu Synchronicity, the talent behind Zaion LanZa, had gone on to release an explosive statement alleging numerous unethical work practices going on at NIJI. Allegations that have had their validity all but confirmed by recent events. But there's something else about these two situations that doesn't seem right. One of the things that I remember seeing in the initial wave of responses to Selen's termination was that a number of people were quick to insist that Zaion did not deserve to have her experiences considered in the same way as Selen's. And so, my question is, why? Why are some people so resistant to the idea that Zaion was also a victim of NIJI's harmful work environment? To answer that question, I'll be breaking down how NIJI handled Zaion's termination in a 3-part analysis. 1. The lead-up to Zaion's termination. 2. The eerie similarities between Zaion's termination and Selen's almost a year later. And 3. The possible rationale behind NIJI's approach to terminating their talents. Throughout this video, I'm going to be referring to the contents of One Girl's Story because it provides necessary additional context to the situation, context that was omitted from Zaion's termination notice and has yet to be provided by NIJI or its representatives in any official capacity. More importantly, it allows us to piece together a complete story, a story that has repeated itself once already and may repeat itself again. This is the story of Zaion LanZa, the Devil of NIJISANJI En. Zaion LanZa debuted on the 10th of December 2022 as one of the original 6 members of NIJI EN's 7th generation, or wave as they call it, ex-Soleil. Alongside her were Kotoka Torahime, Meloco Kyoran, Hex Haywire, Vermilion, and Doppio Drop Scythe. Remember these names because they'll be important later. Not even 3 weeks after her debut, Zaion would announce that she was going on a last-minute family trip starting from the 30th of December until the 10th of January. An odd move for a talent so soon into her career, especially since this meant that she had to cancel a New Year's countdown stream that she had previously promised her fans. And what's more, this was a lie. In actuality, Zaion had been given a suspension by NIJI and had allegedly been pressured by management into disguising this as a voluntary break in her public announcement. The reasons for this suspension were never publicly clarified, but in Sayu's document, she states that these included playing a Genmate's cover song on stream without prior authorization, playing games on stream using accounts that existed from her Vtubing career prior to joining NIJI, and trying to directly contact a manager. Now, as unreasonable as some of these justifications are, what's even more unsettling is how Zaion's own words were used to hide her suspension from the public, instead of any official statement from management. When you're trying to get a feel for a corporation's communication strategy, taking note of who you don't hear from in their communications is just as important as taking note of who you do hear from. Exnomination is the practice of deliberately excluding someone's voice from a public discourse, usually to enhance the clarity of your message by silencing those who might disagree with you. However, that's not the only way exnomination can be used, because sometimes the voice you want to keep the public from hearing isn't someone else's, but rather your own. It's pretty hard to criticize the actions and intentions of a faceless entity, but it gets even harder when those actions and intentions are skinwalking beneath the words and faces of people you've come to trust. What Zaion's first suspension demonstrated was that, where possible, NIJI's management will always avoid speaking up for themselves to the public, while simultaneously trying to hide their true intentions behind the words and faces of its talents. Remember this point, because we'll be coming back to this later. Upon returning, Zaion would do her best to continue streaming as usual, an endeavor that lasted until the 8th of February, when NIJI announced that Zaion would be suspended indefinitely, citing compliance issues. 47 days. That's how long Zaion was allowed to be a NIJI liver for, because on March 10th, 2023, just over a month into her indefinite suspension and exactly 3 months after her debut, NIJISANJI EN would announce the termination of its contract with Zaion. In media school, one of the things that you'll learn about in your first or second year is that news media can create problems. And I don't mean misinformation or defamation or, games journalism. I mean that media outlets can make almost anything look like a problem that threatens the whole of society. And they do this by creating a phenomenon known as a moral panic. A moral panic can be defined as a public outcry that emerges in response to a condition, event, person, or minority that has been portrayed in the media as a threat to society itself. This is usually done through a 4-step process. First, a target subject is identified as an emerging problem. This problem is then exposed as a threat by media outlets, usually in a way that strips it of nuance and/or context. Then, trustworthy commentators are brought in to tell the public how the threat should be perceived and how it should be dealt with, before, finally, the threat is neutralized, having either been completely annihilated in the public sphere or simply fading into obscurity. Regardless of whether a moral panic is justified or not, it's an emotionally taxing way of getting people to care about an issue, one that bears a human cost that often cancels out the value of any awareness achieved. And what's more, this isn't a phenomenon unique to news outlets. In fact, moral panics have been co-opted as publicity strategies on social media by individual users and corporate PR strategies. We know from looking at Zaion's brief career that NIJI's management had already singled her out as a possible problem early on in her tenure. However, what really gives away their attempts at manipulating public perception is how they executed the termination itself. When you read through Zaion's termination notice for the first time, one of the things that might catch your attention is the veritable laundry list of alleged offenses. Some of these bullet points are vague enough that you'd question why they were even included. For example, comments that can be considered offensive to the rights holder of a game during a stream could mean anything from joking about a publisher's affinity for breast milk to complaining that a game is less action than transaction. Other alleged infractions are blatantly misleading, such as expressing her will to perform streams using illegal games, also referred to as pirate games, which, according to Sayu's document, references an occasion where Zaion told her chat that she used to play ROM hacks, technically a form of piracy, but with no indication that she intended to do so again, let alone on stream. But there's one infringement in particular that would go on to become a common talking point in subsequent discussions about the situation, and that is the fourth dot point: offensive remarks regarding discrimination and SA. Now, at face value, this is a pretty heavy accusation, but it's also one that Sayu took pains to address in her counterstatement. As far as offensive remarks regarding SA, Zaion makes no attempts to dispute the gravity of the infraction, with one girl's story specifying the exact stream and the exact joke that led to said offense, before expressing that she takes full responsibility for the mistake and apologizes for it. Although you can find clips of the stream in question, I'm not going to include any here, mostly because there isn't much to discuss since both Zaion and NIJI appear to be in agreement that it constitutes a legitimate infraction. However, my issue with this bullet point isn't with this infraction, but how it was stitched together with an additional accusation of offensive remarks regarding discrimination. In the same section of One Girl's Story, it stated that this particular accusation arose from an interaction that took place during Zaion's second ever stream, when she was jokingly asked by a viewer if they could use the term Zionists as a community fan name. As you can imagine, she said no, but she made the mistake of laughing as she did so. And instead of interpreting this as an expression of nervousness, shock, or a response to the sheer absurdity of that suggestion, NIJI chose to frame it as Zaion mocking the political or religious beliefs of others. More than anything else, it's this deliberate mischaracterization of Zaion's actions that reveals how NIJI went out of its way to not only portray Zaion as an incompatible employee, but a reckless liability that threatened company values. And if that sounds familiar, that's because it's the exact same rationale behind how Selen's termination notice was written. Despite the 2-page difference in length, if you look at the contents of the two documents side by side, a pattern begins to emerge. Both notices emphasize that there were multiple violations of NIJI's activity rules, but when trying to specify what these violations were, both statements then default to mixing legitimate possible infractions with misleading, vague, or even provably untrue accusations of misconduct. But what if I told you that this isn't the only point of similarity between the two terminations? What if I told you that the most infamous and baffling part of Selen's termination actually has a precedent? That a message from NIJISANJI EN was not just a mistake in terms of professionalism, legality, or ethics, but in execution as well, and that we have an example of how it was supposed to work with Zaion. In the aftermath of Zaion's termination, each of the 5 remaining members of XLA would go on to make a public statement addressing the situation. Now, these weren't the only instances where other livers would bring up the topic of Zaion or her termination, but I chose to focus on these 5 statements because they were made by her genmates. 2 of the 5 statements, those being from Vermilion and Doppio Dropscythe, would take place in a small segment of a previously scheduled livestream. In Doppio's case, this was less of a statement and more a vague reference to the situation, one where he thanked his audience for supporting him through tough times and expressed how saddened he felt at recent events, before requesting that he be allowed to focus on more positive things moving forward. Ver's statement, despite being more outwardly critical of Zaion, also appeared to project a degree of goodwill. He prefaces his words by stating his respect for Zaion as a person and as a content creator, before reiterating that the termination was not the result of a single mistake, but multiple infractions. He then expresses personal disappointment with Zaion's actions while mentioning that himself and other members of XLA had tried, unsuccessfully, to advise her in complying with NIJI's rules. However, despite reiterating that he thought the termination was ultimately justified, Ver emphasizes that he had hoped for a different outcome and concludes by wishing Zaion luck in her future endeavors. And if that was all there was to XLA's statements, then this section of the video wouldn't exist. But now we come to the statements made by Zaion's other genmates. 3 individual live streams, each one taking place within an hour of its predecessor, and each one made for the sole purpose of addressing the termination. Earlier on, I mentioned how NIJI's management has demonstrated a tendency to use their talents as a way of delivering their messages to the public and hiding their intentions from the public. We saw this during Selen's termination with a message from NIJISANJI EN, which I covered in my last video. The TLDR of what I said is that NIJI's management attempted to take potshots at Selen's character and Dokibird's counterstatement, under the guise of allowing 3 of their talents to air personal grievances they had with Selen. The thing that confused people the most, especially those with a communications background, is why NIJI would choose to do this. If you look at it through the lens of a PR strategy, using talents to speak on behalf of management accomplishes little else besides tarnishing said talents with the mistakes of management, while also handicapping management by having non-professionals speak on their behalf. However, if you look at this approach through the lens of a moral panic, then things start to make a bit more sense. If all you're looking to do is define a threat, then the bar for what counts as a trustworthy commentator is lowered significantly. Whereas a PR strategy might demand professionals, experts, maybe even mainstream celebrities, a moral panic will settle just fine for victims. In media and communications, there's a term that's used to describe what can happen to a person who's put at the center of a moral panic. Their public image begins to morph and change, becoming progressively less and less human as the threat they pose is repeatedly emphasized, until, finally, they emerge out the other side as a folk devil. A folk devil is a person or minority that gets turned into a symbol of a group's collective fears and anxieties. Folk devils are often conjured to fulfill two functions. On one hand, folk devils can act as a fall guy for a larger problem, and by taking them down, you can create the illusion of solving said problem. On the other hand, folk devils can serve as examples to everyone else of how not to behave, with their persecution acting as a warning of what can happen to those who step out of line. To show you what I mean, we're going to take a look at how these three statements combine to tell the public two things. 1, how Zaion should be perceived, and 2, how she should be dealt with. However, before we begin, I want to reiterate that my focus here isn't on the talents themselves, nor their individual responsibilities for the statements they made. Instead, my aim is to show how their words, regardless of truth or individual intentions, were used by NIJI's management as a weapon to destroy Zaion's character while conveniently keeping themselves out of the picture. So, once again, please don't harass anyone, especially those mentioned here. Of the three statements, Meloco Kyoran's is perhaps the most benign. She begins by expressing how devastated she is at Zaion's termination, before apologizing to both her own and, more importantly, to Zaion's audiences for the situation, acknowledging how some may feel shocked or hurt by recent events. Something I want to point out is that throughout the entire stream, Meloco sounds distraught. Despite the talents having no say in this decision, and despite her obvious emotional distress, NIJI's management chose to have Meloco apologize to audiences not on their behalf, but in their place. Let that sink in for a moment. Meloco, a talent, has essentially been left on her own to address any feelings of discontent that Zaion's remaining audience might harbor towards this termination. Although, thankfully, this didn't happen, had that audience been more inclined to vocalize that discontent in that moment, Meloco would have been the one bearing the brunt of it. It's also worth noting that, whether it was intended or not, her obvious emotional distress would have acted as a deterrent to criticisms of the termination decision, as even discontented audiences were likely to identify with her feelings of powerlessness, an effect which was probably amplified by her unnecessary apology. Now, on its own, Meloco's statement is fairly innocent, even tragic. A helpless talent trying to comfort her audience and who can't find any way of expressing the grief they share besides the words of an apology. However, the implications of this stream become a lot more pointed when you look at how it was contextualized by Kotoka Torahime's statement that came right before it. What makes the presentation of Kotoka's statement so insidious is how it attempts to shape public perception of Zaion under the pretext of implying an interpersonal conflict between her and her genmates. And to show you what I mean, we're going to go through two clips from Kotoka's stream. Here's the first one.
So first things first, about the termination, obviously. Honestly, what's said in the announcement is pretty simple and clear, I feel like. She broke the rules, a lot of the rules. And we, as the XLA member, really tried really hard. We tried really hard to discuss things over with her about her mistakes. We sometimes even fought with her for some things that she wished to be granted upon herself.
There. This one line shifts the tone of the statement by framing the interactions between Zaion and her genmates as a more combative her versus us scenario. And just like that, the idea that the public should view this situation as a conflict between Zaion and her former colleagues is no longer just implied. Neither is the idea that Zaion deserves no sympathy for the manner in which she was terminated. But what solidifies Zaion's role as NIJISANJI EN's very own folk devil is what comes after this.
I might be like that filthy, stupid Gyaru that slacks off on all the council works, and the Gyaru that, is not good with both Japanese and English, just the girl that is not knowledgeable about a lot of the common things around here. But I do know when someone is disrespecting the ones I love. I may be new here, but some of you may hear me live for the first time, actually. But I'm proud to say that I love NIJISANJI. I love all the members that are here with me, here with us. I'm sad to see my gemmates having to apologize for this because, honestly, this wasn't their fault. And for all these reasons, honestly, I don't know if I can say that I'm in the state to wish her good luck on her future ahead for now, Zaion, but maybe in the future, like maybe someday, like when our paths intersect with each other, like I don't know if that's even possible because you came from the future, but that's my personal intake about this.
There is a lot to unpack here. On the surface, Kotoka's statements about loving NIJI and everyone in it might seem fairly innocuous, but it also paints a very specific picture of NIJI's work environment. We are led to believe that said environment is one of mutual support and love. Conversely, this also implies that Zaion was just an aberration, a deviant that threatened the integrity of this safe space and who was rightfully ejected as a result. This perception of Zaion as a liability to those around her is further amplified by the next section of Kotoka's address, where she states this.
I'm sad to see my gemmates having to apologize for this because, honestly, this wasn't their fault.
At risk of stating the obvious, since the decision wasn't theirs to make, none of the talents had to apologize unless they were told to do so by management. However, by excluding any mention of management's role in this termination decision, the statements made by these talents all serve to paint Zaion as the source of all the pain and emotional distress arising from the situation. By contrast, the remaining members of XLA are framed as helpless victims, devastated by the aftermath of the termination, just as their audiences are. And when it comes to NIJISANJI's manipulative use of talent victimhood, nowhere is it put on display more than it is in Hex Haywire's statement. During his stream, Hex reiterates many of the points made by his genmates. However, what separates this statement from the others is how Hex begins his address.
I do want to say first and foremost, as both a liver for NIJISANJI and someone who has suffered through sexual assaults as a young person, or as a younger individual, I cannot condone a lot of the jokes and a lot of the things that she said, and it devastates me. It devastates me because I never would have guessed that it would come to this. It would happen this abruptly.
Now, to be clear, publicly sharing that you're a victim of SA or any other form of abuse is not itself a bad thing. But what complicates the way that Hex has done so here is how his victimhood is being used to qualify his condemnation of Zaion. Regardless of his intentions, this effectively frames Zaion's infractions as a personal slight against Hex and implies a degree of malice behind her words and actions. At best, you could argue that this was done with a neglectful ignorance of how Hex's words would be interpreted by some members of the Western audience as a license to attack Zaion. But at worst, this could be viewed as a deliberate attempt at mobilizing online audiences for a harassment campaign. Ultimately, it is this shared sense of disappointment and helplessness expressed by all three talents that viewers are being encouraged to identify with. It's also what NIJI's management is relying on to give these talents the credibility to speak out about the situation despite them having no say in the termination decision and lacking any PR expertise of their own. Moral panics are especially destructive when they're used in the context of a publicized interpersonal dispute, because they have a tendency to turn perceived victimhood into a source of credibility. As a result, subsequent discussions around the subject of the moral panic tend to devolve into a victimhood contest that further obscures other, more systemic problems that might underlie the situation. And this is what makes Zaion's termination so fucked up, because at this point, NIJI had succeeded in framing the whole situation as an interpersonal dispute between Zaion and the other talents instead of a labor dispute between Zaion and NIJI. So when, almost 2 months later, Sayu would come forward with a personal statement detailing the harrowing experiences of what it was like to work at NIJI, the weight of her experiences were mired in the controversy that NIJI had created around her termination. Although it's never stated directly, one girl's story describes a textbook case of a toxic work environment. One characterized by managerial neglect, adversarial perms processes, a callous disregard for talent well-being and mental health, as well as preferential treatment of some talents over others. And the kicker? All of these issues were brought up again a year later during Selen's termination by a combination of Dokibird herself and NIJISANJI's own statements. NIJI doesn't want you to see the similarities between these two terminations. In fact, botching the execution of their strategy the second time round almost worked in their favor. After all, it's easy to get so caught up in the recent spectacle of NIJI's failure to destroy one of their talents that you might not even realize that they've already succeeded at destroying one in the past. See, Sayu's synchronicity, she survived. Given enough time and in light of recent events, she might come to enjoy some measure of the success she deserves as a creator that managed to join one of the largest Vtubing agencies of her time, regardless of how short her tenure was. However, for Zaion LanZa, It's a completely different story. Isolated, demonized, and silenced with cold precision, there was never going to be a future for Zaion, a fact that she could only have realized once it was already too late. Zaion was no saint, but she was a prophet, one that few listened to at the time on account of her being defined by her mistakes instead of her experiences. This is what it means to become a folk devil. When all is said and done, folk devils are just a symptom of a volatile environment, one where deep-rooted issues exist without readily apparent solutions, where the simple but illusory catharsis of condemning a scapegoat is prioritized over the more complex task of implementing effective reforms from the ground up. NIJISANJI En has time and time again given the public reason to believe that it is one such environment. And in such an environment, where suspicions of favoritism, neglect, and petty conflict have become the norm in the eyes of the public, it only takes a single mistake for someone to be turned into a pariah. It doesn't matter if you're a talent, a manager, or hell, even the CEO. If the culture you've fostered prioritizes scapegoats over solutions, then no one is safe. So to those who might aid in the creation of a folk devil, a word of warning. If anyone can be turned into a folk devil, then the next one could be you.